And we're live. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome
Awesome.
to Codementor Office Hours. My name is Joyce, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here with Safia Abdalla today, and I'm sure you'll have questions for her. So throughout this broadcast, feel free to ask them in the live chat window next to this video. So Safia, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Safia, like Joyce mentioned. I have been working in tech for about 6 years now and in the open source community for about 2 years. I am one of the maintainers on an open source project called Interact, which is a desktop-based interactive computing environment. And if you're curious as to what that means, put a question in the group chat and I'll be sure to answer it. And in addition to being just a maintainer and a developer on open source, I'm really a passionate advocate for increasing diversity in open source and improving inclusion in open source. So I'm active in the community as an organizer and as a speaker. And I'm
Great,
here today to just answer a couple of your questions about open source.
awesome. So to get us started, can you tell me a little about how you got into open source projects in the first place?
Sure. So for me, getting into open source was kind of reaching a personal goal of mine. About a little over 2 years ago, I went to a small mini conference in Chicago called Write Speak Code. For those of you who haven't heard of Write Speak Code, I strongly recommend you check it out. It's a women-only conference, and it's focused on helping women level up their technical careers, and they do that by getting you to focus on writing more, whether it's blogging or writing a book, speaking more at conferences and meetups, and writing code, whether it's personal projects or open source. And so I really wanted to take on the code portion of that. And I sat down one day. I had done some data analytics work in Python before, so I started my first contribution on a data analytics library in Python. Took me 2 days. It was a very simple fix. I kid you not. It was a one-letter change, but just getting everything set up and like figuring out if I was doing everything right, if I was following the conventions in the project took me 2 days. But eventually I did it, and once I got it, I never stopped because it's addicting.
Awesome. So can you talk a little bit more about the projects you're currently working on? You mentioned that you're working on Interact right now.
Mm-hmm. So the main one that I'm working on is Interact. It's spelled N-T-E-R-A-C-T. We're on GitHub. It's a desktop-based interactive computing application. It's entirely in JavaScript, so a lot of the code I'm writing nowadays is React and Redux, and the application is packaged for the desktop using Electron. And that's kind of what I'm in with on the day-to-day basis.
Awesome. So you mentioned earlier that when you first got into open source, it took you a while to just sort of get into the whole, what works, what do you have to do? So for, I guess, new developers, would you recommend that they try and get into an open source project? And if so, how do you think they should do that?
That's a great question. I think you have to kind of evaluate yourself and your own skills before getting into open source. I definitely wouldn't recommend doing it if you're just like a fresh developer. But I would say if you've been working in the industry for a couple of weeks or months, if you've already been in a situation where you've collaborated with other developers, whether at a meetup or at a job, you're definitely ready to dive into open source. In your technical career or journey where you know how to find resources online, or you have mentors that you can ask for help, or you have that support system set up, then it's definitely the right time for you to jump into open source.
Okay. And would you recommend that they start with something relatively small, or maybe like a really, really big project like React, for example?
I would say the size of the project that you're working on doesn't matter. It's the size of the particular issue that you're looking to tackle. So even in a really big library like React, you might find an issue related to documentation or a quick chore that you can do to get you started and kind of dip your toes in the water of open source. I know my first open source project that I contributed to was extremely large. It was an extremely large code base, but I was making a change in one line And that was all I needed to get started. So it's just making sure that you have the right bite-sized issue to make your first contribution.
Awesome. Do you have any projects you can recommend for, I guess, people new to open source?
Well, I'm obviously very biased, but I would definitely recommend Interact, mostly because I've been working hard and the entire team has been working really hard to build a project that's really inclusive to new contributors. So if you go on the Interact GitHub organization or repository, you'll find that we have a new contributor friendly tag, which is a bunch of issues that we've kind of audited and determined are really great for people who are just getting started with open source in the project. I could recommend that people contribute to React because the team is really nice. And then I guess for other individuals, it depends on the kind of language that you want to work with. So if you're a JavaScript programmer, if you're a Python programmer, the recommendations I would make are different. I would say find someone in open source that you think is really nice, or you'd really think they're approachable and genuine, and start contributing to their projects. One of the recommendations that gets given out a lot is contribute to an open source project that you use. And while I think that's a great recommendation, it's also perfectly fine for you to not be using a particular project like on a day-to-day basis and just be contributing because the team is really welcoming, or you feel that you really like their workflow or the way they manage their contributors. So yeah, just like go where your heart leads you, I guess.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see. So I guess what is, for developers who maybe have not gotten started with open source yet, can you tell us a little bit about the differences between working on open source projects and maybe working on a personal project?
Yeah, so with an open source project, my favorite thing to tell people is open source is between you, the people you're directly contributing with, and like everybody for the rest of time until like the sun encompasses the earth and we all die. Mostly because working on a group project, on an open source project, is really about the people. You have a lot of interactions online with people on GitHub issues, on Slack channels, on Twitter, and all of that encompasses the community that you're a part of. Whereas when you're working on a personal project, it's just kind of you on your own. You have a bit more flexibility. You don't have to worry about like engaging with others all of the time, which can kind of be exhausting. And then in an open source project, depending on the scale of the project, you do have a responsibility to other people. You have a lot more independence in a personal project. And sometimes in some open source projects, you kind of have to manage your technical decisions in the context of what other people want and what the project's users want. And so it becomes way more a people-focused initiative than a personal project.
Awesome. So is that also your favorite part about working on an open source project, or is there something particular that you really enjoy?
Yeah, I've definitely had a few like personal projects where it's just something I hack away at on a weekend and then I'm done. But I like the fact that because there's people in an open source project, it continues way beyond your contribution. It's kind of like a city that you're building with other people, and just because you contribute one thing there or you're gone away from the project for a month or a year doesn't mean it's completely dead. Kind of the community uplifts it and keeps your work and your project going.
Awesome. You mentioned earlier that you know, like for Interact, you guys have tried really hard to make it inclusive for new programmers. Can you talk a little bit about how you work to, you know, create an open source community and what you've seen from other open source communities?
Yeah. So one of the first things that we did on Interact was put in just a new contributor friendly tag, which is a really great way to show new contributors that we're kind of taking the time to look at our issue tracker and find things that are good for you. Another thing we did early on was participate in Hacktoberfest. I'm actually wearing my Hacktoberfest t-shirt right now. It was a month-long event hosted by DigitalOcean where if you contributed to open source, you get a free t-shirt, and that engaged a lot of the community outside the immediate people who were involved in the project. Do is just be really fun and friendly on the comments. Comments everywhere on the internet, I guess, but especially in issues on GitHub and pull requests on GitHub can devolve into places of hostility and non-productive communication very quickly. And so part of what we did early on in the project, when it was a very small group of people, was make sure that there was like positivity. So doing things like thanking somebody when they opened an issue, thanking somebody when they opened a pull request, adding lots of fun emojis and GIFs everywhere. Some people might think it's like gimmicky and important to creating an atmosphere of fun, because ultimately what you want to build when you're building an open source community is a space where people can come and contribute in their free time. Excuse my language, but nobody wants to spend their free time working with a bunch of assholes. So it's important to be joyful and fun and welcoming. And so we started very early by setting that tone in our project. We also provide active mentoring to everyone who contributes to our project. Our goal is, even if you're not an expert in some of the tools and frameworks we're using or the language that we're using, we want to empower you to be an expert. We want our open source project to be a learning space for you. So I've definitely spent several hours just on video chat with people who are new contributors, guiding them through problems and helping them work on their pull requests. And kind of having that mentorship is really important to having a successful project, because you don't leave your new contributors out in the cold.
Great. So besides sort of new developers, I know that you've also spoken, you've posted on Twitter, tweeted about this, sort of about minority groups in open source communities. Can you tell us your thoughts about this? And do you think that this is, a really wide issue?
Yeah, I think it is a really wide issue. I'm obviously a woman of color. I have yet to meet another woman of color who actively works in open source. So if you know one who does, please connect me with her. I'd love to meet her. And I think that's just really kind of sad that I've never met anyone like me in the 2 years that I've been contributing to open source and kind of active in the open source community. And this is really because a lot of the biases that are present in tech in general tend to be magnified in open source. In open source, you have to have the luxury of time and money to be able to set aside an hour or two a day, or even a week, to contribute to something that won't put food on the table or pay the heat bill. And for a lot of the individuals that we really want to be in tech, that just isn't a reality. And it touches on so many tough to debug and gnarly issues in the tech industry. But I think that's really a rampant issue, is how do you get minorities and women involved? And it's something that I actively try and work on. Definitely having the various techniques to welcome new developers is important to welcoming minorities as well. And I think just having women as leaders in your project, or people of color as leaders of your project, and providing them an avenue to rise up really magnifies their voices and the decisions that are made in the project. Like, I think a lot of NRAC's successes with getting new contributors and keeping a really positive and engaged community are because there is a woman of color kind of as one of the leaders in the project. I'm there to kind of set the tone and be present when decisions that might be harmful to minorities and women are made. So yes, it's a problem. No, I don't know entirely how to solve it. I'm still thinking on it.
Great. So for those who maybe are maintainers of an open source project like yourself, do you have any tips for them, either just about the project itself, about technical issues, how to deal with these issues?
Yeah, I think one of the really big things to making open source inclusive is to extend beyond your network of friends. And I think this happens a lot when you have an open source project. You tend to share it with the people you work with or your friends who are also developers. And and it kind of never reaches a wider network. I encourage anyone who is a maintainer to bring their project to groups, tech groups that are focused on targeting women, like Girl Develop It or Black Girls Code, or PiLadies. There's tons of groups that underrepresented minorities in tech, so bringing your project to those groups and partnering with them is really important. Making sure that you manage the tone in your project, and ensuring that it's a positive and safe space for people. And then doing little things like having a code of conduct, which defines how people should behave in your project, and what kind of behavior is not tolerated, is really important. And furthermore, enforcing that code of conduct. So when somebody does step out of line, or make somebody feel unsafe or unwelcome in a project, you're willing to shut that down, and act appropriately. So it takes a lot of proactive work. It's definitely exhausting. It's not for the weak. It involves really building your empathy and doing things that might be uncomfortable sometimes. I think a lot of people come to open source because they want to just spend some time hacking in their free time. They don't want to deal with or having to interface with other people. But the reality is that you need to do more leadership and more interfacing with people in open source than you would in your day job, or your career. And so it becomes really important to just actively work to welcome and help out others, and be willing to put yourself in a state of discomfort, especially if it means that your project will be a more welcoming and productive project.
Okay. We have a question on YouTube from a viewer asking, do you have any tips for, I guess, non-English speakers who want to contribute to open source? Because you mentioned earlier that it involves a lot of communication, and sometimes that, it's hard for them to visualize or put into words what they want to express.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about this a lot from kind of the other lens, which is how can English-speaking maintainers kind of keep a perspective on what it feels like to be a non-English speaker in open source, which is very hard. I think the first thing you can do is just make it like explicit. Just say, hey, I'm a non-native speaker, so I might make spelling mistakes, or these are my like limitations language-wise, and just seeing how the community responds. If they're not of that limitation, that they're not the people you want to be with. But if they are a community that's willing to welcome you and work with you, then they'll be very responsive of the fact that you are a second language speaker. I've worked with a variety of people who spoke English as a second language. English is my second language as well. Granted, I've been speaking it for longer than most people who have English as a second language. So I definitely get the importance and the feeling of discomfort that might come with being a non-native contributor. But if you make it explicit, and if you recognize that the project maintainers are willing to welcome you, then you have just the same chance of success in open source.
Great. I hope that answers your question to the viewer who's watching.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Let's see. I know that you are also the organizer of PiData Chicago, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about? I'm assuming that's an offline event. Can you talk a little bit more how you think offline events, sort of the online hemisphere, these can interact?
Yeah. So to give a little bit of context, PiData is an international group of meetups and conferences that are focused on the open source scientific ecosystem in Python. Interact is part of that community. PiData is an offline group. I organize the meetup in Chicago. We meet twice a month. On the first Monday, we meet for speakers night, and on the third Monday, we meet for a hack night. And my goal for the hack night is everyone who attends the hack night leaves having submitted one pull request to an open source project. And I'm there to help them, guide them through the process, answer all of their questions. And I think an offline space is really important because a lot of people feel comfortable online, and that's kind of where they thrive. But a lot of people really thrive on face-to-face interactions and being with other people. And so having both of those places for people is really important. And offline spaces are particularly important because a lot of the annoying, like talking on the internet problems don't exist, like figuring out what tone somebody is speaking in or when they're being sarcastic or not. And so that's why I think it's really important as an open source maintainer or contributor to go out of your way to attend conferences, to attend meetups, to organize them if necessary, and engage with your community in the real world. Because again, it is about the people, and sometimes people engage better offline than they do online.
Awesome. We have another viewer asking sort of what was the story behind how Interact got started? Was it something that you wanted to use yourself, or how did that get started?
Yeah, Interact was started by a friend and mentor of mine, Kyle Kelly, who you should all find on Twitter and follow. He's an amazing person, definitely a great ally, and inclusive participant in open source. So he started the project and showed it to me, and I got really excited in his vision and the way he was kind of seeing things and where he wanted the project to go. So I was like, hey, I want to come help you build this. So I started contributing. I started helping out with the community a little bit, speaking at conferences about it, all kinds of stuff. So it was kind of through my network.
Awesome. There's another question asking whether you think open source software is, because we hear a lot, when people give tips about, how to build up your portfolio as a developer and stuff like that, they'll say, work on some open source. Do you think that's really something that, as a freelancer, or even as, if you're looking for a full-time job, that's something that really helps your portfolio as a developer?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely important. And as someone who will sometimes often get asked by people who are recruiters or hiring managers at companies like, hey, should we hire this person, or do you know the best place to find people to hire? I always say open source. If someone can succeed in an open source project, it shows me that they're willing to learn and get out of their comfort zone, because that's one thing open source forces you to do, is be out of your comfort zone and learn all the time. They know how to communicate with other people because it is a collaborative project. And they are willing to be respectful and kind of give back to the community of open source. And then it's really great for recruiters as well, because everything you do is on your GitHub page, so they can go in and see, how do you respond to comments? How do you respond to criticism on pull requests? How do you engage with other people who maybe you don't disagree with? And all of that stuff is really important when you hire a good developer. It's less about their technical skills, because you can learn to be a better person technically, but it's hard to be a better communicator, or it takes more time to learn to be a better communicator than it does to learn to be a better developer. So I think it's awesome to have in your resume, and it's a good way to build your skills and also feel like you're doing work as you go through your job search.
Great. I think there was another question asking if I have a personal project that I've been working on for a while, sort of how to make that decision to move it into an open source realm instead of just keep working on it with maybe myself and a few friends.
I would say if you're working on it with a few friends, it's already an open source project. And even if you have it up on GitHub, and it's not a private repository is what I'm assuming, it's an open source project, you just haven't made the effort to engage contributors. So I think the question is really, when do I start to engage contributors in my project? And that's really if you feel like you're at a position to where, you can manage a lot of the stresses that come with being a maintainer and having to review pull requests, respond to a lot of issues on a project, and kind of have the project take a bigger chunk of your life, which has its benefits and consequences. Another thing is, are you ready to take on some of the nastier duties that come with managing an open source project, like enforcing a code of conduct, kind of setting up project vision as more and more people become engaged with your work. So really, if you love what you've built and you're willing to make it a bigger part of your life and of who you are, go ahead and make it open source, start engaging contributors, start talking about it actively. But if it's something where like you just did it, you put it online, you don't see a bigger vision for it, or you don't want to engage with contributors on it, then don't. And I've been in both situations. I've been in places where I've welcomed contributors to a project of mine, and I've been in situations where I put something up on GitHub and I was like, let's just leave that there and never talk about it again, or keep it the way it is. And so it's just how much you want to invest in the project in the future.
Awesome. Let's see. Okay. So we've heard before from people who maybe maintain open source projects that documentation sometimes is a big pain for them, because it's hard to get contributors if they only contribute a very small amount of time to write documentation. So do you have any tips surrounding that and how you guys deal with it?
Yeah, so we've actually got a huge issue open on NRAC to add some JS docs, some inline documentation to our JavaScript source. Shameless promo, if you want to get into open source, come help us out with that. And our solution to that was to make it a mentoring available issue. And so if you want, as you get started, you can get one-on-one mentorship from one of the maintainers or more experienced contributors on the project. And that kind of sets you up with knowing how to contribute documentation so you can go forth and like go crazy with it. That being said, I think to have a successful open source project, you do need to have a minimum amount of documentation. In the case of NRAC, the documentation that we're looking to add is, if we were kind of being honest, is a nice to have. It's inline source documentation that's helpful for understanding the API of the project. But other than that, we do have contributor documentation that shows how you make a contribution to the project. We have a user guide that shows how you use the project. We have those two critical things down. And I think for any project, it's important to establish what's the minimum amount of documentation that you need to have to be viable and accessible to new contributors, and then to kind of leave the rest as issues that people can take on if they're a new contributor.
Okay. Let's see. If the audience has any more questions, feel free to also type them into the chat on the right-hand side. Let me see. Okay. So do you think that, I guess there's been I guess some debate, in recent years we've seen some open source projects that are hugely successful, like, React, for example. But for, I guess, the average small to medium company or enterprise, if they're developing a software that's more, for in-house, but they want to open source it, do you think that's helpful for them? Do you think that's something they should do?
I think there's benefits and consequences to doing it if you're kind of a small to mid-sized company. The obvious benefit is with respect to hiring and contributions. If you put something out in the open, you increase the chances that you'll be able to recruit from the new contributor base that comes onto that project. But it also comes in with the additional cost of now having your engineers act as maintainers in addition to staff engineers. And sometimes, depending on the situation of the project, you might also have some legal overhead associated with having an open source project out in the wild. And I think ultimately it's about weighing the kind of pros and cons of being able to hire and recruit from a contributor base. It's kind of great marketing for your company if you have something out there that shows what you do. But then there's also the cost associated with it, and you kind of have to do a cost-benefit analysis and see where you are as a company. I know a lot of companies will put open source as a core value or tenet of who they are, and so they're very active in contributing back to it. And some companies aren't, and that's fine. But it just depends on figuring out your values and the costs that you would have to handle, as well as the benefits that might come from.
Great, thank you. You mentioned earlier in our Q&A that on your first open source project, you sort of spent 2 days just kind of going through the project itself and trying to understand the overall scope. For someone going into a new project, if their project doesn't do what Interact does and tag for newbies, do you have any tips for them and how they can go about understanding a project?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've had a lot of people who like won't have any kind of signals on their issue tracker for contributor friendly or for new contributor friendly issues. And I'm always like, please just add one because it makes things so easy for people. Because the alternative for your contributors is they spend hours pouring through pages and pages of issues trying to find something they can understand. And that's time they could have spent making a code or documentation contribution. So you're kind of just wasting their time. And it takes very little effort on your part as a maintainer to tag an issue. My recommendation to somebody, if they are looking through a project that they want to contribute to that doesn't have anything tagged, to show that it's easy or that there's help wanted or something to indicate that it's there for you as a new contributor, then to probably not consider contributing to it, just because it hasn't established itself as a welcoming space. Of course, you can try and do something like reach out to the maintainer on Twitter and see if they would like help. But if they haven't gone out of their way to make it a comfort, like a welcoming space for you, it might not be the best project to start off with.
Okay, good advice.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you personally do mentoring and also, Interact also, a lot of you do mentoring for your new contributors. For someone who's just getting into, I guess, programming or a new developer, besides sort of open source, do you have any tips for how they can find a mentor that sort of matches their skill level and sort of helps them with their projects?
Yeah, I would say check out any local meetups that might exist in your community for tech. There's a great community online called Newbies. Newbies, like NEWBIES. That's just a community of individuals who are also learning to code. They have a Twitter chat every Wednesday, and it's a super welcoming and engaging environment. And that's a good place to find people if maybe you live somewhere where there isn't a huge tech community offline, or maybe you're just more comfortable engaging offline with people. So those are my two big recommendations for finding mentors, is meetups and Code Newbies. Also, I guess if you can afford to, going to conferences. And Twitter isn't for everyone, but it's a great way to connect with individuals who kind of establish themselves in tech and have more experience and are willing to support and provide mentorship for other people.
Thanks. Let's see. Okay, so I guess I just personally wanted to know, do you have, besides Interact, because that doesn't count, do you have any other, I guess, favorite open source projects that you've really, really enjoyed contributing to?
The React team is really awesome. They're really kind and they really want to improve diversity in their project. Pandas, which is the first project that I contributed to, is also an awesome project. And I'm going to butcher their name, but Zeit, which is a JavaScript focused company. They built things like Now and Hyperterm, is also a great project to contribute to if you just want to have like a quick and painless contribution process. So I'd say those three are kind of my favorite. And Interact. I can't keep it off the list.
Okay. So for developers, currently have a full-time job as a developer, sort of how do you recommend the balance between working on, well, of course, your full-time job, but also trying to find time to work on some open source projects or personal projects even?
Yeah, I struggle with this a lot as well. I think depending on what kind of position you have, there's definitely an opportunity for you, if your employer is okay with it, to do open source during your work hours. Some places might offer like 20% time, or I know some places that will give like all of Friday off for people to just do whatever they want. You can take advantage of those times. If you aren't in that position, there are moments where you can take advantage of like downtime, maybe on the train to work or on the bus to work. You can make a contribution or two or start reading through a code base. And it is the kind of thing, unfortunately, where you have to care about it enough to be like willing to not go out to dinner with friends on a Wednesday night. Well, not that bad, obviously, but you do have to give it some of your nights and weekends. And it's definitely not for everyone. And that's one of the unfortunate limitations of open source, is that it does target people who have the privilege of time. But I think if you have a full-time tech job, if you don't have any kids or parenting or guardianship responsibilities, then it's totally feasible for you to do it on nights and weekends, or during commute times or down times. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So if the audience doesn't have any more questions, okay, then we're probably going to try and wrap up. Safia, did you have anything you wanted to add as sort of last words, advice?
No, I was just gonna say, if you want to make the jump into open source, I'm always there to help. I am Captain Safia on Twitter, so Captain and then SAFIA. Just send me a tweet and I'll be happy to guide you or answer any questions that you might have. There's lots of places that are going to be welcoming communities and that want contributors of all shapes, sizes, colors, opinions, favorite text editors, all that diversity. And it's just about finding the right place for you. And once you find it, open source is a wonderful and magical experience. So yeah, I'm here to help you find that magic and unlock the satisfaction of your first pull request. So feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you have any questions. And yeah, that's it from me.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna send out some links to Safia's website and Twitter and stuff like that. So feel free to follow her. She also does tweet very constantly. I follow her personally, so I always see her tweets on my timeline as well. Yeah, so if there are no more questions from the audience, I think we're just gonna wrap up. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you again, Safia, for doing this Q&A. And that's
No problem.
for today's office hours. Bye, guys.
Nice. Bye.